Good morning. My name is Mike Morrice. I'm a member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre. Merci à tous et à toutes pour être ici avec nous ce matin. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. I'm honored to be joined by Savag Belian, the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of Canada, to share reflections and comments with respect to Azerbaijan's choice to be the host of the climate negotiations COP29 this year. I'll start by turning it to Mr. Belian, and then we'll share reflections from the Green Party caucus. Mr. Belian.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning. As the world prepares for COP29, a critical global conference focused on addressing the pressing issue of climate change, we must confront an alarming reality. This global event is scheduled to take place in Baku, Azerbaijan. Let us be absolutely clear. Azerbaijan is an entirely inappropriate host for this conference. The country that has committed acts of ethnic cleansing, engaged in gross human rights violations, and shown a complete disregard for international law cannot be trusted to lead a global dialogue on climate justice. Azerbaijan is a hereditary petrodollar dictatorship with a shameful record of human rights abuses and oppression. It is a regime that not only perpetuates violence and oppression against its own people and neighbors, but also remains deeply reliant on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels make up about 90% of Azerbaijan's export revenues and 60% of its government budget. In fact, the Azerbaijani government plans to expand its gas production by a third in the next decade, which will result in over 781 million tons of CO2 emissions. How can we, in good conscience, allow a country that is such a significant contributor to environmental degradation to host a conference dedicated to combating climate change? The hosting of COP29 in Baku is a cynical attempt by the Azerbaijani regime to greenwash its ongoing human rights abuses. Azerbaijan's recent genocidal aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh, particularly its brutal attack on September 19, 2023, forced over 120,000 Armenians to flee their ancestral homeland in what is undeniably a case of ethnic cleansing with genocidal intent. Furthermore, Azerbaijan continues to arbitrarily detain Armenian prisoners of war and political prisoners, subjecting them to inhumane treatment in defiance of international law. Azerbaijan already used greenwashing through false flag environmental protesters, which blocked the only connection between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, the Lachen corridor, from December 2022 until last year's session in September 2023. The International Court of Justice found that the protests were part of a government scheme to deprive the population of Artsakh of the necessities of life motivated by racial prejudice against Armenians. Azerbaijan's authoritarian government is infamous for its repression of political dissent and lack of media freedom. With a score of just 7 out of 100 in Freedom House's Global Freedom Index, it ranks among the world's most repressive regimes alongside countries like Russia, North Korea, and Syria. This environment of political oppression and corruption starkly contradicts the inclusive and transparent nature of the international climate negotiations that COP29 is supposed to represent. In addition to its poor human rights record, Azerbaijan's economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas, with major foreign investors such as BP, Total Energies, and Russia's Lukoil poised to spend billions on the country's gas operations. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's renewable energy targets are woefully inadequate, overshadowed by its ongoing investment in fossil fuels. The wealth generated from Azerbaijan's fossil fuel industry has not benefited the entire population, with significant portions of the country remaining underdeveloped and impoverished. Moreover, Azerbaijan's geopolitical alliances with Russia and Turkey, coupled with its ongoing destabilization of the South Caucasus, further call into question its suitability as a host for an international climate summit. This geopolitical instability threatens to undermine the inclusive and cooperative spirit required for a successful COP conference. There is no doubt that Azerbaijan is using the COP29 conference as a public relations move to improve its international image rather than a genuine commitment to climate action. The restrictive environment for activism and civil society in Azerbaijan further limits the effectiveness of any meaningful climate discussions that may take place. Independent activism is heavily restricted, stifling the public discourse and grassroots movements that are essential to driving global climate action. We, the Armenian National Committee of Canada, call on the Canadian government not to afford Azerbaijan the privilege of hosting any Canadian elected official at the COP29. While it is critically important that Canada continues its leadership on climate action, Canada must make it clear that it stands against the exploitation of global platforms such as COP29 by autocratic regimes seeking to cleanse their image. We urge the international community to take this opportunity to expose and denounce Azerbaijan's abhorrent human rights record and environmental misconduct. The ANCC's position is clear. COP29 must not be hosted by Azerbaijan. This regime's human rights abuses, environmental recklessness, and geopolitical destabilization make it the least suitable host for a conference dedicated to the pursuit of climate justice. Canada and the global community must take a stand, rejecting Azerbaijan's greenwashing efforts and holding it accountable for its atrocities. Only then can we hope to achieve the real, lasting progress on climate change that the world so desperately needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Savag. Speaking on behalf of Green MPs, Greens will be boycotting COP29. This is actually the first time that Green MPs will not be at a climate negotiation of this kind since 2016, when Elizabeth was on the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. At that time, that commitment held her back from joining that particular year. And actually, it's the first time ever that no Green MPs will be attending intentionally as a result of the choice of the host country. And as you heard from Savag already, Azerbaijan is a major oil producing nation, and so its credentials are questionable on that standing alone. But it's the reality of the ethnic cleansing of Armenians that make this choice all the more appalling, and is the reason for which Greens will not be attending. Our call as Greens to the government of Canada is for Canada to engage at the minimum possible. What we mean by that is we recognize that our minister needs to be there to negotiate, but where in past COPs we've had a Canada pavilion, for example, our call as Greens would be for that not to be the case at COP29, and for Canada's presence to be limited to the required negotiations for Canada to participate in, and for that to be a stance from the Canadian government to call out this choice and the process that led to this choice. With that, we'll turn to questions. Nous sommes disponibles, Savag et moi-même aussi, pour les questions pour ceux et celles qui sont ici avec nous. Merci encore. Thank you again for joining us. We'll turn to questions now.
Sure. Hi, Rafa Bujikanian, CBC News. It seems like your goals are somewhat aligned on this. Savag, if I understood correctly, you want the government of Canada to boycott this event entirely. And Mike, you were saying, I get it, the minister has to go, but like, let's not throw our flags up there at a pavilion. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you reconcile these two slightly different approaches together?
Maybe I can begin, Savag. I guess for our part as Greens, we want to ensure that the Armenian community's voices are being heard, and being heard clearly, as you heard Rafi this morning from Savag directly. As Greens, we want to also make clear our position. And while there is, as you noted, a slight differentiation in that position, what we are shared in is the calling out of ethnic cleansing of Armenians, the ongoing human rights abuses by Azerbaijan, and our calls for Canada to take a stand. And as you note, that stand is slightly different. As Greens, we are calling for Canada's presence to be as limited as possible. But in our view, we do recognize that Canada needs to be there to negotiate, And we also call out the process by which Russia had a veto on the choice, that this was the Europe and Central Asia year for this particular COP. And we are, very concerned with how these choices are being made and the outcome here. Savag, did you want to say more?
Thank you, Rafi. I think we're generally very aligned in terms of our stance. As I said, we're calling on Canadian elected officials to really follow in Elizabeth May's steps, really, to denounce Azerbaijan's record and to not afford Azerbaijan the privilege of hosting Canadian elected officials. Having said this, we certainly do believe that Canada cannot back away from such an important conference. And I join Mike in saying that our call is really to keep it at a completely minimum level and keep it very on a bureaucratic level, even, I might say, and not afford Azerbaijan the privilege of hosting Canadian elected officials.
I guess you both know that Armenia is hosting COP16 next year. That just came out this week. Do you view that as like a balance for Azerbaijan hosting COP29 this year, or does it not matter?
Speak for Greens, first of all, following on your earlier question, Rafi, as Greens, as elected officials, we're following the calls from the Armenian National Committee for not having elected officials to attend. And that call is separate and distinct from the host nations of COP16 or any other climate negotiations. In our view, human rights abuses aren't something to be balanced. It is simply that countries with a record that Azerbaijan has on its own standing should not be the host.
Yeah, on the biodiversity COP, I would certainly say that we definitely don't view it as a balancing act. They're two different conferences. Yes, generally within the same realm, but in terms of caliber of the conference, it's significantly different. And Armenia, in this case, it's a country that does not produce fossil fuels, doesn't have the same type of abhorrent human rights record as Azerbaijan, and we continue to view this the hosting of COP29 in Azerbaijan nothing but a greenwashing tactic and a whitewashing tactic to cleanse its image internationally, something which Armenia doesn't have to do. Thank you.
I guess I just want to refer back to the September 2024 statement by Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly on the events of Nagorno-Karabakh last year. She did say, ethnic Armenians have the right to return to their homeland. She did say that the conflict needs to be resolved peacefully. I guess I'm wondering, isn't it sufficient for the Canadian government to express that part of it clearly and then still have the environment minister go to COP29 just because of the importance of this conference?
Whether Minister Guilbeault is attending or not, we don't know yet. A statement hasn't been made by ECCC. But should Canada be represented on that level, our call to Minister Guilbeault and to the government would be to echo the messages that came out from the government in September while in Azerbaijan. I think that would be very important, and it would be viewed very positively, not just by the Armenian community, but generally, I would say, because not echoing the same messages would certainly send a different message, a message that could be manipulated by the Azerbaijani regime within the context of hosting all different delegations from different countries.
Rafi, I can add to that to say that what you've heard this morning is a call to reflect the Government of Canada's actions with respect to how they engage at COP29 to mirror their rhetoric of recent months. And so that would then reflect on the choices to be made with respect to Canada's presence. And again, as Greens, we would call for that presence to be as limited as possible, to focus on the negotiations that are required, and to use that as a mechanism to make clear our concerns with the human rights record of Azerbaijan and its choice as the host of COP29.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. C'est ce qui conclut la conférence. Merci.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.